We'll now be looking at the Scheveningen variation of the Sicilian defense, which begins after e4 and c5. The Sicilian defense is the most popular variation to play after the move e4, and we're going to be looking at the open Sicilian in this video, which begins after knight f3, d6, and d4. The open Sicilian trades off the d4 pawn for the c5 pawn, so white loses a center pawn, but he does gain more central space. So after trading the pawn off, knight f6, white defends the pawn with knight to c3, and black plays e6. This is the Scheveningen variation. There are multiple ways for white to play this, so we'll go over each of them. White can either go bishop e2, which is a classical variation, g4, which is the sharp curious attack, bishop e3, which is the English attack or English variation. There's also the g3 line here, the Sicilian attack with bishop to c4, or the Tal variation with pawn to f4. Let's look at the f4 first. If white plays f4, black just plays a6, bishop e2, and bishop e7. This is a pretty common position after castling. White can move his king to get off the diagonal, and black just simply plays as he usually does with queen c7, followed by b5 later. If white plays a4 to stop b5, then black will be playing b6, and feuding his bishop anyway. If bishop to f3, we stop the threat of discovery on the diagonal with bishop to b7. If e5 is played here, then just simply trading off the pawn, followed by knight to d7 is okay. White has an open position here, and he has a little bit more space with this pawn on e5, but on the other hand, this pawn on e5 might be a weakness, and black does obtain an open position that's very playable for him. Another variation is to play g3. If white plays g3, then black can just simply play knight to c6. We don't want to open up this diagonal anymore because he's going to put his bishop onto g2. So we play knight to c6 this time, and we don't even play the move a6 and b5. After bishop to g2, we simply just go bishop to d7. After castling, we can go a6 to stop the move knight to b5. But after a4, we can just simply play the bishop to e7. If he moves his knight back to b3 to try to play a5, that's okay, we can just castle. And if he does indeed play a5, now we don't need to worry about any discovery along this diagonal, so now we can play b5. If he does take on b6, queen takes b6, he can play bishop to e3, winning a tempo on our queen. But we can play queen to c3, queen to c7, and we can use the open files on the queen side to our advantage. Another popular variation is to play bishop to c4. If bishop to c4, then once again we have the same ideas. We play a6, the idea is to play b5, gaining a tempo on the bishop. If the bishop comes back to b3, then we just go b5 immediately. Our idea is to play bishop to b7 to attack the e4 square, and we have b4 later on threatened as well. If castling, then we should play bishop to e7, just more development. And if queen to f3, threatening this discovery here, we can play queen to c7, the idea being that e5 doesn't work right now because of bishop to b7. Therefore, he plays queen to g3, attacking our pawn on g7. We castle to protect it. And he can threaten mate here, but that's not a big deal because we can just play knight to e8. If he goes rook to d1, then we can just go bishop to d7, more development. And if he does play f4, we can play knight to c6. This pawn here is not that weak. Black has enough defense for the king. He can play bishop to f6 if needed. And if king h8, then this bishop has to move again. Meanwhile, black can use the open diagonal over here to create some tactical ideas, and his pawns are already pretty advanced on the queen side, so he can start some counterplay there pretty quickly. Another line is bishop to e3, which is the English attack. This attack is pretty sharp, and black needs to have some theory known in this line. After a6, then f3, the idea is that white will play g4 immediately and start the kingside attack. Black therefore plays b5 and starts his queenside attack likewise. After queen to d2, we can go knight to d7, and after g4, we need to stop the move g5, so black will play the move h6. White will castle now, and now we can continue developing with bishop to b7. White will try to play g5 anyway with h4, and this is when we need to play the move b4. b4, we're attacking his knight on c3, and we're forcing his knight to make a move. White should play his knight to a4, It seems like it's trapped, but we always have the b3 move, so it's not really trapped just yet. For example, if queen to a5, which is the main move that we play here, then white is forced to play b3 to save the knight. We now can trade the knight off, and if the knight does accept the exchange, for example, if he takes, then we can take here, and now it looks like he's going to lose his pawn on a2. Therefore, white will accept that you can take his knight there and play the move a3. The idea is that after knight takes a4, you don't actually win a pawn, because after a takes b4, the queen has to give away control of the a4 square, and the next move white can play b takes a4. This line is okay for black, but I think there's a better move. There's a better move that black can play here, and it's rook to c8. The idea is that if you take on b4 now with the pawn, then we can take on b3, forking the queen, and after you take back with the knight, then we can take on a4. The pawn is pinned, so the pawn on c2 is pinned, so you can't take back. Therefore, if queen to b4 here, then we can just play queen to c7. Now, after knight takes c5, d takes c5, and queen a4 check, knight to d7, and then knight to e2. Sure, white is up a pawn, but after c4, black actually manages to begin his attack faster than white, and white needs to either weaken his pawn structure on the queen side, or accept that black is going to start an attack very soon. Another line that you must know if you're playing the Scheveningen is the curious attack, which begins after the move g4. After g4, the idea is to simply just play g5 as soon as possible. Though you don't need to panic in this line, you can just simply play the move a6, and then if g5, we move our knight back to d7. If white just continues development with bishop to e3, once again we continue development normally as well, knight to c6. White can be aggressive, he can play the move h4, that's fine. We can just play the move queen to c7, just more development on our own part. We're going to play these moves anyway. We don't care if we waste moves playing h4, g4, g5. That's not such a huge deal for us. If queen to e2, once again, more development, just bishop e7. And if castles, we can just play b5. These are moves that we're going to play anyway, so it's not like we're playing anything specifically against the g4, g5 system here. And if simply just takes bishop d4, we can play b4. And forcing the knight to go back. This is the most aggressive line, and black will have to delay castling for a little bit. But black's king isn't really unsafe in the center, and I think it should be fine for him to play. Black also has counterplay on the queen side, as his pawns are also very high there. If white plays bishop to e2 in this line, this is called the classical variation. This one is pretty simple as well. White will try to play bishop e2, bishop e3, and a4. And black has this typical setup, which is just a6, bishop e3, bishop e7, queen d2, and castle. After castle, white may castle queenside, and if he does that, then we can play knight to c6. If h4, then we can simply trade and play b5. If he tries to attack us with h5, we always have the move e5, driving his queen back, and bishop e6. h6 doesn't really do much, you can just play g6. And if he plays the move, for example, f4, then we don't need to worry about this bishop being attacked because bishop c4 is always an option. We can play queen a5 right now, threatening the move b4, winning the a2 pawn. And if king to b1, then we can play bishop to c4 right now. After queen to d2, black actually has a nifty tactic here to use. It's knight takes e4. This wins a pawn because after knight takes e4, obviously queen to a2, and this will be mate. And if the knight doesn't take, well, he also has a problem because we will win this knight here. Another option is that if white plays f4 here and doesn't play the queenside castling variation, we can still play the same idea, just knight c6, castle, castle. And if he plays a4, we just go queen to c7. Now when white spends time to get his king off of the diagonal here, the open diagonal, then we can just play bishop to d7. And after knight b3, we can just play b6. We don't want to let your opponent play a5. That would be very crushing. He has more space, too much space on the queen side, in fact. And that would not be pleasant for black to play. But here we have this idea of after, for example, bishop to f3, after rook to e8, if he plays g4, it's not such a bad thing here because after, for example, h6, G5 doesn't do much, and even if you don't want to play H6, you can always use the center to make counterplay against the white's attack on this side. I hope after this video you realize that white's setup is pretty simple there. Doesn't matter what white plays though, black's setup is simply just to play knight to c6, bishop to d7, bishop to e7, a6, b5. It's important to note that if white plays the move a4 at any time, to try to play a5, we must not let him play a5, and we should play b6 to stop him from playing a5. We don't want to give him that much queenside space. Also, maybe in some lines, for example, the Kira's attack after g4, we have to do some special moves, for example, move our knight back to d7, but that's okay because we can always find a solution. For example, we can move our bishop to b7 if needed, and we can just simply delay castling if we feel that the king side is too unsafe. In these kind of situations, I feel like the pawn center here is pretty safe. It's very solid. I don't see that this pawn center is a problem for black, and it's really hard for white to attack this pawn center, so if the king side is actually very weak, black can keep his king in the center for a little bit, and I don't think that will be a big problem for him either. In general, black should get an open position here with some chances on the queen side, and this should be a very good challenging opening for white to deal with.